Welcome to Uncommon Sense, where we do our best to make it common again. I'm your host, Adrian Ahlquist, and today I'm joined by David Deavel, Dr. David Deavel, actually. He is a Catholic Studies professor at the University of St. Thomas, a frequent contributor to our Gilbert Magazine, and a featured guest on Chesterton on Tap, which is the exclusive video series that we've produced at the Society for members of the Society. And you can go to chesterton.org/membership to join that and watch that. So David has been really kind to us and given a lot of time to us. And he also gave a talk at this year's Chesterton conference, and his talk was called The Happy Warrior. And that's what we're going to talk about today. How are you, David?
Fine. Thank you for having me, Adrian.
Absolutely. It's great to have you. So yes, your talk was called The Happy Warrior, and you start by saying, we live in a dark time. Why is that?
Well, I think that many of the things that Chesterton was seeing in 100 years ago, they've only advanced since his time. This falling away from sort of Christian underpinnings of the way we think about reality, at least in England and the United States, and more broadly Europe, and even the parts of say, East Asia and elsewhere, where there was at least some acceptance of that view of reality, that common sense view, it has largely gone away, in part because of many of the intellectual problems that Chesterton himself identified and made fun of, and also proposed solutions to. So we're just seeing this sort of long process, and it's getting worse and worse. But Chesterton could say in 1930 that it's almost impossible to satirize anything. Things have gotten so crazy. And we look back and think, well, 1930 was the good old days. But in reality, many of the same things that he was talking about, they either didn't go away or they've come back. When I teach a course here at the St. Thomas, used to be called Woman and Man. Now it's called something like Sex, Gender, and Catholicism. But when we talk about things like marriage, we talk about these proposals that people have for, we're going to change marriage to make it like a driver's license. You get it for 5 years. If you want to re-up, fine. But these are the kinds of things that Chesterton was arguing against, 110 years ago. And so they either didn't go.
He said an amazing line, so prophetic. Frivolous divorce will lead to frivolous marriage.
That's right.
We see that for sure. I think, I can't imagine people disagreeing with that.
No. So all of these problems that he saw have only gone farther. We've developed more technology, but losing the common sense, we can see how fractured things are now in a way that he would not have been surprised at. And he would not be surprised at all that for all of our technology and for all of our material wealth, unhappiness and suicide are commonly the answers.
Right, exactly. So you propose a solution, or at least a partial solution, right? What would that solution be?
Well, if you want to put it in the way my grandmother used to put it, it's that for many things in life, you're either going to cry or you're going to laugh. And I think that's Chesterton's solution, as well as I talked about John Henry Newman in this talk. Their solution, I think, was quite often not necessarily to just cry, but to laugh at it, because there is a laughter that comes from understanding that Christ has conquered all on the cross, and so it's a laughter of hope. But there's also a laughter at just the ridiculousness of evil and the ridiculousness of people trying to propose solutions that are not solutions at all, but instead dissolutions. They tear everything apart. But they're ridiculous at the same time. Right.
That makes sense. So even though it's really hard to satirize what's happening, we have to do it. Otherwise, it's either we cry or we laugh. Sometimes at the same time, but still, I would agree with that. So you mentioned that satire takes imagination. Why does it take imagination? First of all.
Well, Chesterton says that, to correctly satirize something, it's like doing a caricature. And a caricature is not just a funny picture, but it's a picture that emphasizes certain ridiculous parts of a person. And so satire is emphasizing the ridiculous parts of ideas and proposals and
Yeah.
writings. And so you have to have a certain sense of imagination about, well, which part, if I overdid it and exaggerated it, would be both most hilarious and most revealing about what's wrong with the idea or the proposal. So it
Mhm.
involves seeing, a number of different possible ways to talk about and to depict, wrong ideas and wrong-headed proposals and wrong-headed people even.
Yeah, and that makes sense. A lot of very talented comedians nowadays, you'll see how they look at something in a new way that the common person or the common audience member nowadays wouldn't do. They put a new twist on something, and it's very imaginative a lot of times. And yeah, but the other thing you said satire takes is reason. So why would that be?
Well, because in order to properly satirize something, you have to be able to see why it's wrong and why, if you actually followed and exaggerate, and by exaggerating what I was talking about before, Chesterton says what the exaggeration is really just following the principles to their
Yeah.
conclusions. So showing why these bad ideas, if you actually really did them and were consistent about them, would be ridiculous, and you wouldn't see them. So it takes a reasonability to see why they're wrong and why actually following them leads you to the sort of the dire circumstances, dire, but also sometimes ridiculously funny circumstances that
Right,
you
right.
you might be able to recognize reason by.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It takes creativity and reason. That's a
Yeah,
lot of the human components right there.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So you also mentioned that satire presupposes, this is what you said, it presupposes moral superiority or standard or principles. And
yeah.
that's very interesting to me. I didn't think of, I'm at like I get why it takes imagination and reason, but where does the moral standards come into it?
Yeah, well, I mean, when we're looking at a proposal, what we're doing is we're not just. I mean, Chesterton uses. I think I mentioned in my talk. He uses the phrase that it's a satire is a fantasia upon pure logic, which makes it sound like it's just this sort of light and whimsical thing too.
Mhm.
But of course, it's not just a criticism of somebody's logic, but it's a criticism of somebody's use of logic to get to a position that we ultimately see as morally wrong, but many people can't see why that is. So that's where the reason comes in. But to be able to see that no, there is a superiority of one set of actions, of one set of proposals, it's that's an important part. It's not just logic that we're criticizing, as if somebody had failed to carry the two when they were doing their calculus, but
Mhm.
instead we see that they've set up principles which are not only wrong, but they're in some sense morally wrong, even if it's sometimes hard for ordinary people to see why those principles really don't work.
Yeah, yeah, and I remember Kyle Mann, the podcaster with the Babylon Bee, who was at our talk. He mentioning how they might make fun of certain trends or cultural things within the Christian community, but
Mm-hmm.
they won't just make fun of the Bible, or they won't.
Right.
Yeah, they wouldn't do it like that because that's kind of like assuming that the Bible is wrong, and
Yeah.
that's just not as funny, or it just doesn't
Yeah.
hit right, you know. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. A lot of comedians, I think, fall victim. C.S. Lewis in the Screw Tape Letters has a letter where Screw Tape talks about humor, and he talks about various kinds of humor.
Yeah.
And Screw Tape identifies, and I think this is very much in Chesterton's line, that the worst form of humor, worst being meaning morally speaking, is the kind of joke that takes as its main principle that something good is just not to be thought
Yeah.
of. And that's what many people think satire is. But to really be good satire, both morally speaking and I think actually to be funnier, it's got to have the right moral component in it
Hmm.
that shows you not only ridiculousness but also shows you a way forward.
Yeah. Yeah. So you also say you also make a contrast between satire and wit. What
Yeah.
would you say is the difference between those two things? Because a lot of people might use them interchangeably, but I
Yeah.
know that there's an important distinction. So what would that be?
Well, satire definitely involves wit, and wit Chesterton defines as reason on its judgment seat. So you can see, as we've talked about these components before, there is a kind of a moral and a reasonable quality which really are sitting in judgment. But satire, the best kind of satire, isn't just sort of sharp and savage, although it has certain qualities of that. But for Chesterton, the best satire is that which also allows us to see our own common humanity. It's not just, if wit is reason on its judgment seat, satire is, at least in Chesterton's view, reason on its judgment seat, but also with a full awareness that I'm a human being
Hmm.
who
Yeah.
also partakes in this. Now, this is why some people thought Chesterton really wasn't a satirist, and I don't think that that's an accurate position. I think Chesterton had a view of satire that was perhaps more humane, and not just more humane, but maybe more divine, because it allows one to be a satirist without losing one's soul.
Right, right. Yeah, you say how wit, there's an element of pride, but with
Yeah,
satire, there's an element of humility that's very apparent. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. So you also incorporate into your talk Newman, and part of that was because you were in depth in Newman conferences, right?
yeah,
And so Newman and Chesterton are often paired together. You say how Chesterton is one of the great theologians of the 20th century, and Newman was one of the great theologians of the 19th century. But why? What does Newman have to do with wit and stuff? Because and satire. Because Chesterton, he is very funny a lot of times. Was Newman that way? And what? Yeah. What is? How is he relevant?
yeah. Well, I mean, Chesterton is very much a fan of Newman. I've talked at earlier conferences for the Chesterton Society about them in general together, and one of the things that we know is that Chesterton was asked very early on in his writing career, something like 1901.
Mm-hmm.
What are the 5 books that you need to read? And of course, there was Thomas Aquinas, but then there was the Sermons of Newman. And we know from his writings that he dwelt upon many of the same themes. In many ways, I consider them very complementary partners, because Chesterton just has a very different style, and he has a different kind of imagination to
Mm.
bring out many of the same points in a completely new and accurate way. But he also saw that, because he was actually paid attention to what Newman was doing, he didn't fall for what many people said. Well, Newman's he's this severe Oxford Don type who's very serious. Chesterton understood that Newman was very gifted at satire, and he talks in his book, the Victorian Age in Literature, about Newman he talks about him as having like a sword of wit, particularly in many of his polemical works. But
Mm.
he also says about Newman's famous work, The Present Position of Catholics in England, which was a response to an anti-Catholic uprising. He says, there's something, grander than humor. There's fun in the way Newman makes fun of the ideas that people have about Catholics.
Mm-hmm.
So Chesterton, I think, realized about Newman's ability to have fun and not just be witty and have reason on its judgment seat, but that ability to have fun and be wild and crazy, if you will, was something that I think went into Chesterton's idea of what proper satire is like.
Yeah, yeah, and it's very tempting for people to elevate seriousness to a virtue, and
Yeah,
we've talked about this before, but it's not, and that's what Chesterton says in Orthodoxy. Serious is actually closer to a vice than a virtue,
right,
and it's humor that is the virtue, because angels take themselves lightly, and Satan fell due to the force of his own gravity,
right,
uh, and which is
yeah,
a great line, because gravity means grave, serious, and so
right,
that's where we get
yeah,
that. Um, and yeah, it's just funny, because a lot of the times I think people will misinterpret humor as thinking of the situation as frivolous, or like it doesn't matter, but actually we make fun out of it. We make fun of it because it does matter.
hmm
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, Dennis Prager, the radio show host, has a famous book that he wrote called "Happiness is a Serious Business" or something like that. I thought, there'd be a great Chesterton book. Humor is a serious business.
Yeah, yeah. He needs to read more Chesterton, right?
Right,
Maybe
right,
he has secretly.
I know he's mentioned him on the radio. I mean, a lot of people
Nice.
say, oh, here's a quote by Chesterton. I just love this. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then there was, you mentioned Bellock in your talk, how he seems like his weapon is more of an axe, and he goes in hard, whereas Chesterton is more fine tuned, and he's, I think, more humble about his humor. Right?
Yeah. People, I mean, people. I've met a lot of people who have been converted by Chesterton. Very few. I mean, I'm not saying there are none, but Bellock is somebody who sort of bulks one's spirits once one is Catholic. But he can be a little bit. He can be a little bit harsh when it comes to his humor, and he scored Chesterton in his sort of posthumous account. I quoted it in the talk. It was printed as a little sort of pamphlet about the position of G.K. Chesterton in English letters. And he says, Chesterton didn't have the sort of, that killer instinct to really, drive the sword in. And, I think that's true, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because Chesterton knew that the victory was quite often not necessarily to dig the sword in, but to let the person understand where he is already wounded. And maybe come to a position of wanting to know the truth better. And Chesterton's more lighthearted, more humorous and humble, satirical position may have been a better weapon.
Yeah, and that's why you mention the YouTube videos nowadays, like blanket such and such destroys this other person, blah blah blah. Yeah. It annihilates this person, and how you say you don't really watch those, and I actually don't really watch them either, because they seem like unnecessarily combative, and it just leaves you with a bad taste in your mouth, right?
Yeah. It's like Bellock was the kind of person who probably would have he liked to destroy his enemies. There's that famous when the debate that Chesterton did with was it Shaw or Wells? I can't remember, but Bellock, is then sitting in the moderator's chair, and of course he says something like, I'm not here to debate, but to sneer. So, Chesterton never really sneered. I mean, he could get fiery and he could get excited, but he didn't sneer at people, and I think that's a great gift. To not want to just simply destroy people, right, but to actually break down their bad ideas and build them up. And maybe do it in a creative way.
I guess the one cathartic time is when that person is being extremely prideful or arrogant. And you sometimes do, you're like, okay, there's pride comes before a fall. I mean, we do like to see justice. But otherwise, it's maybe, unnecessary. Yeah. But so comedians nowadays, I mentioned comedians. There are a lot of clever and very talented comedians, I think. But a lot of them are very sad, I think. A lot of them, there's some underlying mental health issues. I think they would be the first ones to admit that. And maybe a lot of times they use comedy to maybe distract themselves, or maybe it actually is healthy for them to do comedy. What do you think about that? Do you think that's a good thing? Do you think Chesterton actually was in the same boat, or was it slightly different? I'm kind of curious.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, the tears of the clown are, my wife doesn't like clowns, and I think a lot of
unfortunate analogy, but yeah.
Right. But, just the general phrase, Yeah. But of any kind of person, I think that's a pretty common thing. And, you could take it as, I began with my grandmother's phrase, you're either going to cry or you're going to laugh. And I think for many people that really does come out of their experiences, that they can't cry or they don't want to cry anymore, and so they laugh. But it's a kind of a bitter laughter. And that's why there have been certain moralists throughout Christian history who've almost gone so far as to say that laughter is kind of almost, is almost immoral, because you're always sort of laughing down at people. And, and I understand that position, that could be the case. It's sort of like anger. Well, there could be righteous anger, but most people become unrighteous quick. Um, but I don't think that Chesterton had that. In fact, I think when Chesterton was at his weakest, it was when he was probably most fierce and most Bellock-like. And when he was at his most successful, it was because he had that capacity to sort of step back and see how ridiculous this thing was, and to be very clear, but also to laugh at it and to show that to show that aspect that we talked about a little earlier, that part of the laughter is really going to come out of that mirth that secretly Christ has actually won, even though it appears that the cross is the final word. And I think that joy is what really drove so much of Chesterton's humor.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. I think the reason it is different is because the humor, the satire, is mixed with gratitude, and that's what we do not see a lot of times today. People forget. They don't only forget, but they don't have someone to be thankful to in a godless world. And so Chesterton did have that gratitude, and it shows forth, and that's why I think there's not that mental health issue, honestly.
Right.
But that's very interesting.
But you can tell from his relationships with people too. Many of the people that he satirized most, like Shaw and Wells, loved him deeply. And you just have somebody like H.G. Wells, some of whose books are really the subject of, The Everlasting Man is just one long refutation of Wells' outline of history.
Yeah.
And yet, and there's a little bit of mockery, especially in the first part of that book. But Chesterton was such a good friend to him that, Wells was famous for saying that, well, if I ever get to heaven, it will really probably only be because I'm Gilbert's friend. And you think, that's not the kind of relationship that you can imagine between many of these people who are busy crushing and destroying each other on live TV these days.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I guess my last question is, where's a place to start? If you're a person if you're actually a person who wants to laugh, but maybe is not funny, that's actually a practical situation. What would you do first? What was the first change that you would make?
Well, given the fact that, as we've said, that humor is in so many ways connected to humility, I think it's maybe prayer is the first step toward being funny. Because when you start to take God seriously and not yourself, you start to see the ridiculousness in yourself. And I think that also will then change the way you look at others, because you'll begin to see their own ridiculousness too, and you'll have a different sort of attitude, because it's very easy to just get angry at our friends and our relatives, our neighbors and our coworkers, for the patent stupidity that they get around to. But humility allows us to see that, I'm pretty stupid sometimes too.
Right.
And not only am I stupid, I'm ridiculous. Now, let me take the same sort of charity that I would take to myself and take it to them. And all of a sudden you start to see, you don't just sort of, grit your teeth and clench your fists, but you start to think, oh my gosh, that's nuts. And then once you start to think that way, you think, well, what is so nuts about that? And you start to exercise both that reason and that imagination that we talked about to think about, boy, that's when we start using that power that Chesterton and Newman both emphasize, our capacity for analogies. Well, that would be like, them doing that is just like, and then we start the wheels a going. And quite often, it takes, even for professional comedians, it takes a lot of work. I remember hearing an interview with Jerry Seinfeld, saying that he would every day he would write down, he would work on his jokes for 2 hours, but then like every other comedian, he would have to test them out, on audiences. And that's why, comedians, are always going on the road, because they have to test out their work, because
get the data.
You might think, well, I figured out why that's ridiculous and I found the perfect analogy, but you determine that other people just don't think it's funny. And that's fine, because then you can think, oh, well, what is it that would make people see the ridiculousness of that? So you exercise that humility, and then I think it'll free our reason and our imagination to do that. But then I think just, listening to funny people, I mean, there's obviously,
Right.
I recommend Chesterton's poems in many ways, his sort of mockery. I quoted his, the Song of the Strange Ascetic, where he's making fun of vegetarians and anti-alcohol people. And I mean, they're really funny poems.
Mm-hmm. And maybe if people focus a little bit on that and take a step back from STEM, I remember you mentioning that, it's really hard if your life is engulfed in chemistry, calculus. And I have a respect for that. I come out
Absolutely.
of engineering. But if you're only in that world, you start to go mad. The mathematicians that go mad, as Chesterton would say. So yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, you have to have the fantasia upon logic and not just logic.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much, David. Very enlightening. We eventually, I think, we'll have your talk ready for members. But in the meantime, I encourage everyone to become a member at chesterton.org/membership, and you can watch the series that David recorded with my dad, Dale. It was on The Man Who Is Thursday. So it's commentary on The Man Who Is Thursday. It's very, very fascinating and insightful. But yeah, thank you, David.
Thank you, Adrian.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Until next time, help us to make uncommon sense more common.